nice to speak to you, sir.
Nice to see you, Greta. Thanks.
Senator, I understand that the Senate Republicans have asked Speaker Johnson to hold off sending the articles of impeachment from the House over to the Senate. Am I right, and why?
Well, we think that the Senate needs to have time to process and debate the articles of impeachment coming over from the House. And it's pretty clear that Chuck Schumer wants to just shut it down immediately. We believe that this issue, the southern border, which is basically the subject of the impeachment, articles of impeachment, is a national security crisis. It is a debacle, and a debacle created by President Joe Biden and Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Those are the two people that have been instrumental in what has been this massive run-up in the number of people coming across the border illegally. 7.4 million people apprehended, another 1.8 million gotaways. Last year, 22,000 Chinese nationalists, 351 people on the terrorist watch list. Those are the people that have been caught. That doesn't count the gotaways, and that doesn't count the unknowns. I mean, this is a complete and utter failure and disaster. Somebody needs to be held accountable. The House of Representatives has passed articles of impeachment. We think the Senate needs to conduct a trial, and Schumer is trying to circumvent that, which would be unprecedented.
Well, in light of the fact that we're inching up on the November election, the voters, the American people, will get to decide whether or not to keep President Biden. He can decide whether or not to keep Secretary Mayorkas as his secretary. Is it too late? I mean, you're not likely going to convict him in the Senate and boot him. So what is the purpose doing it now in April?
Well, one, I think that obviously the issue is the fundamental issue for most people as they think about the election in November. And 62% of Americans, it has been shown in polls, actually support the impeachment of Mayorkas. And so when the House acts on this, and they went through the process that you would, and then they submit it and send it over to the Senate. We think the Senate ought to examine the evidence, ought to consider the merits of the arguments made by the House, and actually come to a conclusion up or down on whether or not to convict him. In terms of the timing of this, I think what's important here is the precedent. I mean, this is a huge failure of this administration, and a failure which rises to the level, according to the House people who passed articles of impeachment, of high crimes and misdemeanors. I mean, the way they've handled the border for the last 3 years is just an absolute travesty of justice, and I think it's a miscarriage of justice. I think it's really important that the Senate have an opportunity to consider the case.
In your opinion, is it high crimes and misdemeanors of the Secretary of Homeland Security, or if he is executing what the president wants him, would the high crimes and misdemeanors more aptly be put on the president's lap?
I think you could make that argument, clearly, that he works for the President of the United States, but there has been, there is precedent throughout history of cabinet secretaries who have violated their oath, so to speak. And in this case, again, we think that the handling of the southern border is certainly exhibit number one in just complete failure, and failure which, frankly, in my view, is intentional. They went through, in terms of the policies that have been effective and working, reversed all those to reverse course, and abandoned what had been working in exchange for policies literally that are waving people across the border on a daily basis. The way they've changed the parole policies, the way they've changed the asylum policies, you can go right down that list, Greta. It's intentional, it's wrong, and it's a violation of the laws of our country, which need to be adhered to and followed. And I think that's ultimately falls on Mayorkas.
What I find so baffling about him is I look at the tapes, and I've been down to the border, and I look at all the people crossing, and then you listen to him, and it's almost as though he's looking at something different than I am. It's almost as though he doesn't see this when he testifies before Congress. I don't get it. It's very baffling to me, as though he doesn't seem, to have the attention to it that I would expect. But maybe he does.
Well, I think they're just flat out misrepresenting it. I don't know how you can come in front of a congressional committee and say the border's secure. I don't know how you say that with a straight face. I mean, we're talking about just in the last 3 years, 9 million people, 7.4 million who've been apprehended, another 1.8 million gotaways, and who knows how many people that just literally were unknown coming across the border. But I mentioned the number of people on the terrorist watch list, the number of Chinese nationalists, the people that are concerning in terms of gang members and criminals, etc., people with records. This is completely out of control. It was totally avoidable, and in my view, it's intentional. So when he comes up and misleads members of Congress about the border being secure, that is a basic, flat, issue of honesty and integrity when it comes to carrying out the duties of your office. And I think that's why, the articles of impeachment as passed by the House of Representatives need to be considered by the Senate on the merits, on the evidence, and then a conclusion drawn up or down on whether or not he ought to be convicted and, in other words, expelled from the office.
Senator, thank you very much for joining me, sir. We'll be watching next week to see what happens.